The courthouse in downtown Columbus was unusually crowded that morning. Reporters lined the steps, their microphones extended like spears toward anyone with a badge or suit. Cameras clicked constantly, catching every expression, every whispered word. The case had drawn national attention, not only because a decorated police officer sat accused, but because the star witness was barely 3 years old. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with a low hum of tension. Lawyers shuffled papers, jurors shifted in their seats, and spectators filled every bench, clutching notebooks or cell phones. The air itself felt heavy, as if justice were a living thing that might buckle under its own weight. At precisely 9 o'clock, the bailiff's voice rang out. "All rise." Everyone stood as the judge entered, his black robe brushing against the polished wooden floor. Judge Harold Gaines was known for his composure, a man rarely rattled by theatrics or sensational headlines. But even he couldn't shake the unease twisting in his gut. He knew what was coming. The prosecution's key witness, little Emily Carter, was about to take the stand. The double doors creaked open, and all heads turned. Emily walked in holding her mother's hand. She was impossibly small, dwarfed by the solemnity of the room. Her pink dress was slightly wrinkled, as though chosen in haste that morning. Her curls framed a pale, worried face, and clutched tightly against her chest was a battered stuffed bunny with one floppy ear bent. Awkwardly, the room went still. Her mother, Sarah Carter, guided her slowly toward the front. Sarah's face told its own story. Sleepless nights, fear etched into every line, and the fierce determination of a parent who would not let her child's voice be silenced. She avoided looking at the defendant, the man who had once worn a uniform of trust, but now sat accused of unthinkable crimes. Reporters scribbled frantically, capturing every detail. To them, this was spectacle. To Sarah, it was survival. When Emily reached the witness stand, the bailiff bent down to her level, smiling gently. "Sweetheart, do you know where you are?" Emily's voice was a whisper, barely audible. "Court." The jury leaned in, straining to hear. "That's right," the bailiff said kindly. "And do you promise to tell the truth?" Emily clutched her bunny tighter. "Ho." Judge Gaines cleared his throat, his voice uncharacteristically soft. "You may be seated." The little girl climbed into the oversized chair, her feet dangling several inches above the ground. The sight tugged at even the hardest hearts in the room. Here was innocence fragile, unpolished, untouched by the complexities of law, placed at the center of a battle between truth and corruption. The prosecutor, District Attorney Linda Marino, approached carefully. She was known for her sharp cross-examinations, but today her tone carried warmth. "Hi, Emily," she said, crouching slightly. "Do you see anyone here you recognize?" Emily hesitated, scanning the room. Her gaze slid past the jury, past the attorneys, and finally landed on the large German shepherd sitting obediently near the bailiff's chair. The dog, her eyes widened, and her tiny lips parted in shock. The room seemed to hold its breath. Slowly, hesitantly, she raised her finger and pointed at the canine. The courtroom fell into a silence so complete it felt unnatural. Even the reporters paused mid-scribble, pens hovering above paper. "Emily," Marino asked gently, "do you know that dog?" The little girl nodded, her curls bouncing slightly. "Yes." The judge leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "And where do you know him from?" Emily swallowed hard. Her bunny trembled in her grip. "He was there." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. The defense attorney shot to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. Leading the witness, she's a child. She doesn't understand what she's saying." "Overruled," the judge snapped, though his voice faltered. His pen, resting between his fingers, remained motionless. Marino's expression hardened. "Emily, sweetheart, can you tell us what you mean?" "Where was he?" Emily glanced at her mother, who offered a small, encouraging nod. He was there. When the man took me, the room erupted, spectators whispering, reporters scribbling, jurors shifting uneasily. Judge Gaines banged his gavel. Order, order in the court. But his hands trembled as he gripped the handle. All eyes now fell on the defendant. Officer Daniel Briggs, decorated with medals for service, sat at the defense table, his face tightening with each word. His once confident posture began to crack. Sweat shone faintly on his brow. He reached for his water glass, but didn't lift it. Meanwhile, the K-9 sat motionless, ears perked, eyes fixed on Emily. Emily's voice, though small, carried across the chamber with haunting clarity. He didn't bark. He just watched. Her words hung in the air like smoke, impossible to clear. Jurors exchanged uneasy glances. Reporters scribbled furiously. The defense attorney pressed his lips together, realizing this child's testimony was far more dangerous than he had anticipated. The judge's face paled. He leaned back in his chair, tugging at his collar, as if the walls were suddenly closing in. Emily shifted in her seat, swinging her little legs nervously. She looked at the dog again. He knew. She whispered softly. No one moved. The prosecutor straightened slowly, her eyes locked on the jury. She had been in courtrooms for over 20 years, but never had she seen 12 grown adults look so shaken by the voice of a child. Behind the defense table, Briggs shifted uncomfortably, his jaw clenching. The faint twitch of his left hand betrayed nerves he couldn't contain. He glanced at the dog, his former partner in countless operations, and for the first time, fear flickered in his eyes. Emily hugged her bunny tighter, her gaze never leaving the animal. And the judge, usually so composed, felt his pen slide uselessly from his fingers, clattering onto the desk. His complexion was ashen because in that moment, everyone in the room realized the same terrifying truth. If the K-9 remembered, if Emily's story matched what investigators suspected, then the thin blue line protecting a decorated officer had just begun to unravel. The trembling finger of a 3-year-old girl. The gavel struck again and again, but order was slow to return. The words of a child so simple, so untainted, had already cracked the courtroom's foundation. The jurors whispered among themselves, leaning close, their faces pale. Reporters scribbled furiously, eyes darting between Emily, the K-9, and Officer Daniel Briggs, the defendant who now sat motionless, his eyes fixed on the polished table before him. His once proud uniform, adorned with a neatly pressed tie, seemed to suffocate him under the weight of accusation. Order! Judge Gaines barked again, his voice sharper this time. Yet, despite his booming tone, the faint tremor in his hand betrayed unease. He leaned forward, elbows resting heavily on the bench. For the first time in his long career, he could feel the scales of justice wobbling in real time, tilted not by seasoned attorneys, but by the voice of a child. Emily, oblivious to the full weight of her words, clutched her stuffed bunny tightly. Her tiny fingers kneaded the worn fabric. She swung her dangling feet, her little patent leather shoes tapping nervously against the wood. The prosecutor, Linda Moreno, approached the stand again. Her heels clicked softly, yet each step felt like thunder rolling across the room. She crouched low, meeting Emily's wide eyes. "Emily," she began softly, careful not to let her tone carry the sharp edge she used with adult witnesses. "Can you tell us again, where did you see the dog?" Emily's eyes drifted back to the K-9. The German shepherd sat calmly, ears perked, eyes steady. To the jury, it was just an animal trained for obedience. But to Emily, it was a living reminder of her terror. Her lips quivered, but she nodded. "He was there when the man took me." The defense attorney shot to his feet, almost knocking over his chair. "Objection. Speculation. The child is far too young to comprehend what she's saying. All she did was point at a dog," the attorney continued, his voice rising. "This is a manipulation of innocence, Your Honor. It should be stricken from the record." The prosecutor rose, calm but firm. "Your Honor, the witness identified a canine associated with the defendant. That is direct observation, not speculation." Judge Gaines lifted a hand, silencing both sides. He stared at Emily for a long moment. She looked back, her gaze unwavering despite the tears threatening to spill. The judge's lips pressed into a thin line. He was pale, his knuckles white as they clutched the edge of the bench. Finally, he exhaled. "Objection overruled," he said quietly. The defense attorney dropped back into his chair, his face flushed with frustration. Briggs finally moved, shifting uncomfortably. His jaw tightened, his eyes narrowed on the little girl who, with nothing more than innocence, threatened to unravel everything. Doc Moreno turned back to Emily. "Sweetheart," she asked gently, "when you say the man, do you know who you mean?" The little girl's chest rose and fell quickly. She pressed her bunny to her lips, as if seeking courage. Then, slowly, she lifted her hand and pointed. Every person in the courtroom followed her trembling finger dot. It landed squarely on Officer Daniel Briggs. A collective gasp shook the chamber. Someone in the gallery whispered, "Oh my God." Briggs stiffened, his jaw locking in place. His attorney leaned toward him, whispering frantically, but his eyes never left the girl. For a moment, the facade of a decorated officer cracked, revealing something darker beneath. Emily's small voice cut through the thick silence. "That's the man who took me away from Mommy." Her words, pure and uncoached, fell like stones into water, sending ripples of shock across the room. The mother, Sarah, broke down in sobs, burying her face in her hands. Jurors shifted uncomfortably, some visibly shaken, others glancing nervously at Briggs. The judge's gavel struck hard. "Order! I will have order in this courtroom." His face, however, was ashen. His pen had rolled off the bench earlier, and he hadn't even noticed. His usually steady voice cracked on the last word. Doc Moreno allowed the weight of Emily's words to settle before continuing. She knew better than to rush such a revelation. "Emily," she said gently, "are you sure? Is that the man?" The child's nod was slow, but steady. Her curls bounced slightly. "Yes," he said. "He said Mommy wouldn't find me." Gasps again. Briggs clenched his fists under the table. His attorney grabbed his arm, whispering, "Don't react. Don't you dare react." But the jury had already seen the twitch in his jaw, the flare of his nostrils, the way his eyes darted like a cornered animal. The canine handler, seated a few rows back, looked down at the floor, shame flickering across his face. He knew the bond between a dog and its handler was built on trust. To see that loyalty twisted into silence, used against a child, was almost unbearable. Emily hugged her bunny again, whispering so softly it was nearly lost. The dog wanted to help. Linda Moreno leaned closer. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Emily blinked, her small face tightening with effort to remember. "He looked at me when I cried, but the man pulled him back. He told me if I told, the dog would never come home." Her words sliced through the silence like a blade. The jurors recoiled. Some stared at Briggs with disgust. One woman covered her mouth with her hand, tears forming in her eyes. The defense attorney shot up again. "Your Honor, this is outrageous. The child is inventing stories, fantasies. She cannot be relied upon as a credible witness." Judge Gaines pounded his gavel. "Sit down, counselor. Now." The courtroom was no longer a chamber of law. It was a battlefield of morality. The jury wasn't just listening to testimony. They were feeling it, living it. The innocence of a child painted a scene no adult could ignore. Briggs' composure faltered further. He wiped at his forehead, though the sweat immediately returned. His eyes flicked to the K9 again, then back to Emily. For a split second, panic flashed in his expression. He leaned toward his attorney. "We have to shut this down," he hissed under his breath. But it was too late. Marino's eyes locked with the jury. She didn't need to embellish, didn't need theatrics. Emily's words were enough. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said softly, almost reverently, "you just heard the truth. Out of the mouths of children, it often comes the clearest." The judge sat back, pale and shaken, his gavel resting uselessly in his lap. He looked at Emily, so small, so fragile, and then at Briggs, a man who had once carried the authority of the badge. And he realized, with a cold certainty, that justice had just shifted irreversibly. Emily, oblivious to the magnitude of her courage, simply laid her head on her bunny and whispered, "I want to go home." And the room, filled with adults who had spent their lives in law, order, and procedure, suddenly felt the crushing weight of a 3-year-old's truth. The air in the courtroom had shifted. It was no longer merely tense. It was electric, charged with the weight of a truth too terrible to ignore. For years, Judge Harold Gaines had presided over cases involving violence, corruption, and betrayal. He had sentenced hardened criminals and listened to the broken testimony of victims. But never, not once, had he felt the ground beneath him tilt as it did now, when a child's trembling finger pointed across the room and accused a man sworn to protect the law. Officer Daniel Briggs, decorated veteran of the force, sat rigid in his chair, as if the wood itself were holding him upright. His face was a mask, but it was cracking. His jaw clenched so tightly the muscles rippled under his skin. His eyes, once calm and confident, darted from the little girl to the jury, to the dog, and finally to the judge. For a moment, he seemed less like an officer and more like an animal cornered. Emily's words, "That's the man who took me," continued to reverberate in the chamber, replaying in the minds of every juror, every spectator, every reporter furiously scribbling notes. The stillness that followed her declaration was not silence. It was the stunned absorption of a collective truth, settling heavily on all who had heard it. The defense attorney, Jonathan Reeves, snapped out of his paralysis first. He shot to his feet with theatrical urgency, his voice trembling with forced outrage. "Your Honor, I must object again. This testimony is dangerously unreliable. The witness is a 3-year-old child. Children at that age are impressionable, imaginative. She could be repeating something she overheard from her mother, or worse, she could have been coached." The judge's gavel cracked against the block. "Counselor, you will not shout down this testimony. Sit." Reeves inhaled sharply, his face coloring, but he obeyed, sinking back into his chair. He leaned toward Briggs, whispering furiously, but his client didn't react. Briggs's eyes remained locked on Emily, unblinking, as though the child had somehow stripped him bare with a single gesture. Prosecutor Linda Moreno stepped forward deliberately. She understood the fragility of this moment. Push too hard, and the child could crumble. Move too gently, and the defense might reclaim control. It was a balancing act, a razor's edge. "Emily," Moreno said softly, crouching again to be at eye level with the girl, "I know this is very scary, but you are doing so well. Can you tell us what you remember about that night?" Emily's small fingers twisted in the bunny's ear. She looked at her mother, whose face was streaked with silent tears. Sarah Carter gave a slight nod, though her trembling betrayed the depth of her fear. Emily turned back to the prosecutor, her little chest rising and falling rapidly. "The man came when it was dark," she whispered. Her voice wavered, but carried clearly in the stunned quiet of the courtroom. "He knocked hard. Mommy was asleep. I thought it was a monster." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Moreno's voice remained calm, steady. "And then what happened?" Emily closed her eyes, as though trying to push away the memory, but the words spilled out, halting yet vivid. "The dog was there. He didn't bark. He just stood by the man. The man picked me up. I cried, he said. He said if I was quiet, the dog would get to go home. Gasps erupted again. One juror's hand shot to her mouth. Another juror, an older man with graying hair, shook his head in disbelief, his eyes wet. Judge Gaines raised his gavel instinctively, but the sound died in his throat. He couldn't bring himself to interrupt the child. Not now. Emily opened her eyes, blinking rapidly. He smelled like smoke, she added, wrinkling her nose. And he had a shiny thing on his belt. Her hand made a vague motion, mimicking the shape of a gun. Marino's throat tightened, but she nodded, coaxing gently. Do you see that man now, Emily? The girl lifted her hand again, steady this time, pointing straight at Briggs. Yes, that's him. The jury froze, eyes darting between the officer and the child. Briggs shifted finally, his hands clenching into fists. His attorney whispered urgently, "Don't react. Keep your composure." But the jury had already caught the slight tremor in his shoulders, the twitch of his jaw, the dart of his eyes. Marino rose to her full height and turned to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, you've just heard a direct identification. Not prompted, not fabricated. Pure memory. Ask yourselves, could a child this young invent details so precise? Could she fabricate the presence of this canine, or recall the smell of smoke, the weapon on his belt? Reeves sprang up. Your Honor, I demand. Sit down, counselor. Judge Gaines thundered, though the pallor of his skin betrayed his internal struggle. The canine, oblivious to the human drama unfolding, shifted slightly, his nails clicking softly on the floor. Emily's eyes followed him. He wanted to help, she said suddenly, her small voice cutting through the silence. The prosecutor froze, her head tilting. The dog? Emily nodded. He looked at me. He knew I was scared. But the man pulled him back. A pin could have dropped, and it would have echoed. One juror leaned forward, elbows on knees, staring at Briggs with narrowed eyes. Another scribbled furiously on the notepad provided, her hand shaking as she wrote. Marino's voice dropped lower, softer, almost reverent. Emily, did the man say anything to you? The child swallowed hard, hugging her bunny closer. He said Mommy wouldn't find me. Sarah Carter broke, sobbing into her hands. Her body shook, the sound raw and uncontrollable. A deputy moved toward her, but she waved him off, clutching the bench with trembling fingers. Briggs shifted again, his breath audible now, shallow and quick. The jury watched him like hawks, and every movement fed their growing suspicion. Moreno turned back to the little girl. Careful now. Emily, you've been very brave. You told us something very important. Do you feel safe now? The child hesitated. Then she nodded, laying her cheek against the battered bunny's head. I feel safe with Mommy. A tear slipped down Marino's cheek, though she masked it quickly. She turned to the judge. No further questions at this time. The silence that followed was deafening. Judge Gaines cleared his throat, though his voice cracked slightly. Defense. Your witness. Jonathan Reeves stood slowly, straightening his tie. His expression was smooth, but sweat glistened at his temple. He walked to the stand with a forced smile, crouching slightly, as though speaking to a child in a kindergarten classroom. Hello, Emily, he said, his tone dripping with false warmth. I'm Jonathan. I'd just like to ask you a few questions. Is that okay? Emily hugged her bunny tighter, silent. Now, sweetheart, Reeves continued, sometimes when we dream, we think things are real, don't we? Could it be that you had a bad dream about a scary man? Emily blinked, considering. Her voice was small, but certain. No, it wasn't a dream. It was real. Reeves forced a smile. Are you sure Mommy didn't tell you about this man? Sarah Carter, gasped audibly. "How dare you, Mrs. Carter?" "Silence," the judge warned, though his tone lacked its usual force. Emily looked at Reeves with a seriousness far beyond her years. "Mommy didn't tell me. I saw him." She lifted her finger again, pointing directly at Briggs. "That's the man." The courtroom erupted once more. The judge's gavel pounded. "Order, order." But his pale face, the beads of sweat at his temple, told the truth. He was rattled, shaken to his core by the unshakable certainty in a 3-year-old's voice. And Officer Daniel Briggs, once a figure of authority, sat shrinking in his chair as though the very weight of that tiny finger was crushing him inch by inch. The jury could barely breathe. Emily's second, unwavering identification of Briggs had pierced through every doubt the defense tried to plant. Even the defense attorney's polished mask had slipped, if only for a moment, as though he'd realized the little girl wasn't going to fold under pressure. But courtrooms are battlegrounds, and Jonathan Reeves wasn't a man who conceded easily. He forced a smile, pushing away the sweat beating at his temple, and tried again. "Emily," he said gently, "sometimes when we see someone in a uniform, it makes us think they all look the same. You've seen many police officers before, haven't you?" Emily blinked. She tilted her head slightly, as if confused by the question. "Not like him." Her words fell like stones. "Not like him," Reeves repeated, a nervous laugh escaping. "But how can you be so sure?" The girl's brow furrowed. She lifted her small hand, then mimicked emotion across her chin. "He has a scratch here." All eyes shot to Briggs. Instinctively, his hand twitched upward toward the faint scar along his jawline. He dropped it quickly, but the jury had seen enough. One juror's eyes widened. Another whispered to her neighbor, the sound sharp in the silence. Reeves froze. His throat bobbed as he swallowed. "No further questions," he said hoarsely, retreating quickly to his table. Briggs's face darkened, his fists pressed white against the arms of his chair. The jurors were no longer looking at him with curiosity. They were studying him with suspicion, even hostility. Judge Gaines cleared his throat, his gavel tapping softly. "The witness may step down." Emily's mother rushed forward, gathering her daughter in her arms. The little girl clung to her mother's neck, burying her face there as though she'd just spent every ounce of bravery she had left. The courtroom watched silently as Sarah carried her back to her seat, whispering soothing words. When the jurors looked at Emily again, it wasn't pity they felt. It was respect. Somehow, a child had stood taller than grown men in this room. Moreno, the prosecutor, adjusted her papers with calm precision, though her heart was racing. She had known Emily's testimony could be pivotal, but the level of detail the child delivered, the scar, the smell, the mention of the K9 was a gift no lawyer could manufacture. And Briggs's reaction, it was as damning as the testimony itself. But Moreno wasn't finished. She rose. "Your Honor," the prosecution calls Detective Aaron Whitfield. The tall, broad-shouldered detective strode to the stand. His demeanor was calm, but his eyes burned with quiet intensity. After swearing the oath, he sat, shoulders square, voice steady. "Detective Whitfield," Moreno began, "you were the lead investigator on the Carter case, correct?" "Yes, ma'am," he replied. "Can you tell the court what you discovered in relation to Officer Daniel Briggs's involvement?" Reeves shot up. "Objection." "Leading sustained," the judge said, though his voice was flat. Moreno adjusted without missing a beat. "Detective, what steps did you take during your investigation?" Whitfield nodded. "We interviewed multiple witnesses. REVIEWED, surveillance footage from nearby traffic cameras, and examined Officer Briggs's duty logs. We also looked into his prior cases, particularly those involving his assigned K9. A ripple moved through the gallery. Reeves straightened, sensing danger. And what did those duty logs reveal? Moreno asked. Whitfield's jaw tightened. That on the night Emily Carter was taken, Officer Briggs logged himself on patrol in a different precinct across town. But surveillance footage showed his cruiser near the Carter residence around the same time. Gasps filled the courtroom. Briggs's face flushed crimson. Reeves leapt to his feet. Your Honor, this is circumstantial at best. Surveillance can be misinterpreted. Those cameras are notoriously unreliable. Judge Gaines raised his gavel but didn't strike it. His eyes lingered on Briggs for a moment before he turned back. The jury will determine the weight of this evidence. Objection overruled. Proceed. Moreno's voice sharpened. Detective, did you find any other irregularities in Officer Briggs's record? Whitfield nodded grimly. Yes, several. Cases where children claimed to have been approached by a man with a police badge and a K-9. In each case, no official report was filed. The incidents were quietly dismissed, listed as unsubstantiated. The murmurs grew louder. A woman in the gallery shook her head in disbelief, whispering to her neighbor. Reeves shot up again. Objection. Irrelevant past cases. Moreno was ready. Your Honor, it establishes a pattern of behavior. Overruled, Gaines said, his tone heavy. The jury will hear it. Briggs shifted in his chair, sweat streaking down his temple now. For the first time, his composure cracked fully. He glared at Whitfield with a hatred so sharp it chilled the room. The detective didn't flinch. The Carter case wasn't the first time suspicion fell on Officer Briggs. It was simply the first time a child was brave enough and alive enough to identify him. A stunned silence followed. Sarah Carter's sob broke it, raw and aching. She clutched Emily tighter, rocking her gently. Reeves fumbled his papers, his voice high-pitched as he scrambled. Detective Whitfield, you're implying a great deal. But you don't have proof, do you? Isn't it true you found no physical evidence tying my client to Emily Carter's disappearance? Whitfield's lips curved in the faintest smile. Not until last week. The courtroom collectively inhaled. What do you mean? Moreno asked quickly. Pouncing, Whitfield leaned forward, his voice low but clear. Last week, during a search of Briggs's property, we found a storage locker he had rented under a false name. Inside were personal items, small toys, shoes, even photographs that did not belong to him. Among them was a pink ribbon hair tie. Emily's mother later identified it as belonging to her daughter. The eruption in the courtroom was deafening. Reporters shouted, people gasped, and Sarah Carter nearly collapsed, her knees buckling. Deputies rushed to steady her as she clung to Emily. The judge's gavel thundered, demanding silence. His face was pale, his lips pressed tightly together, as though fighting back nausea. Order! Order in the court! But it was too late. The narrative had shifted irreversibly. Briggs was no longer merely accused. He was implicated in something darker, something long hidden. Reeves stammered. This is inadmissible, fabricated. Your Honor, sit down, counselor, the judge barked. You'll have your chance on cross. Reeves sat heavily, his face drained of color. He glanced at Briggs, who stared back with eyes wild and unrecognizable, like a caged predator realizing the bars were closing in. The jurors whispered furiously among themselves, their notepads filled with scribbles. One young juror, no older than 25, stared at Briggs as though seeing him for the first time, not as a police officer, not as a man, but as a monster who had hidden in plain sight. Moreno stepped closer to the jury box. Her voice was firm, resonant. Ladies and gentlemen, the testimony you've just heard from Detective Whitfield is not imagination. It is not fabrication. It is evidence. It is history catching up to a man who thought his badge could shield him forever. And it was unlocked by the courage of a 3-year-old child. Her words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Judge Gaines rubbed his temple, his hand trembling. He had presided over justice for decades, but this trial was eroding him from the inside. The pale look on his face wasn't just shock, it was recognition. Recognition that he, too, had once signed off on those unsubstantiated cases. He had trusted the badge more than the children who whispered the truth. And now, with Emily pointing her tiny finger, all of it was unraveling before his eyes. The courtroom had transformed into a pressure cooker. Every breath, every shuffling foot, every whisper carried weight. The evidence presented so far was damning. Emily's unwavering testimony, her identification of Briggs, the K9 silent watch, Detective Whitfield's discovery of the storage locker and the toys. The gallery murmured constantly, reporters scribbling furiously, but all of it felt secondary to the scene unfolding at the witness stand. Briggs sat rigid, his hands clasped tightly on the table. His face was pale, lips pressed into a thin line, eyes darting nervously to every adult who dared meet his gaze. For the first time, his confidence, the kind that had earned him medals and commendations, was gone. He was exposed, vulnerable, and terrified. Jonathan Reeves, his defense attorney, tried desperately to regain control. He approached the stand slowly, forcing a polite smile at the child who had become the centerpiece of this trial. "Emily," he began softly, his voice almost coaxing, "you are very brave. Very brave indeed. But sometimes people remember things differently. Could it be that what you saw wasn't really him? Could it have been someone else in a uniform?" Emily looked up, her large brown eyes steady and clear. "No," she said simply. "It was him." "I know." A hush swept over the courtroom. The jurors leaned forward, captivated by the child's certainty. Even Judge Gaines shifted in his seat, glancing at the tiny figure who had already upended the trial's balance. Reeves forced a chuckle. "Sweetheart, you know people like to play pretend sometimes. Do you play pretend?" Emily shook her head, holding her bunny close. "I don't play pretend about scary things." The courtroom went quiet again, the weight of her honesty settling on every adult present. Reeves's jaw tightened. He turned toward Briggs, who was fidgeting now, his hands trembling ever so slightly. "Officer Briggs," Reeves said, trying to regain some authority, "is it possible this is a misunderstanding?" Briggs didn't answer immediately. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. Finally, he muttered, "No, it's not a misunderstanding." The gallery gasped. The officers in the room shifted uneasily. The K9 handler stared at the floor, uncomfortable with the unspoken truth pressing against them all. Marino rose again, her tone calm but sharp. "Emily has been brave enough to tell the truth. Detective Whitfield has provided evidence to support her claims. Now, Officer Briggs, did you threaten the child to keep a K9 silent?" Briggs's hands clenched into fists. His voice came out low and shaky. I didn't mean to." "You didn't mean to what?" Marino pressed. "Take a child from her mother? Threaten her with a dog she trusts? Or to hide evidence of previous incidents?" The courtroom felt like it was holding its collective breath. Briggs's face twisted, a mask of fear and anger. He rose, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is false," he shouted. "I served this city honorably. You sit." Judge Gaines bellowed, pounding his gavel. The sound cracked like a whip through the tense chamber. Briggs slumped back, his anger choked by the weight of the room's scrutiny. Marino turned to the jury, letting the silence settle. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you have seen is more than testimony. It is corroboration, evidence, and a child who is speaking truth in a way most adults cannot." Emily, sensing the tension, hugged her bunny tighter. Tears threatened to spill from her eyes, but she held firm. She glanced at her mother, who whispered softly, "You're safe." "You're doing so well." Whitfield returned to the stand, this time bringing with him a small folder of photos and documents. He handed them to Moreno, who displayed them to the jury. "These are photographs of items recovered from Officer Briggs's storage locker," Whitfield said. "Small toys, a pink hair ribbon, clothing. Some were identified by Mrs. Carter as belonging to her daughter. Others match descriptions Emily has given in her testimony." The jurors leaned forward, shock and disbelief written clearly on their faces. A reporter whispered to a colleague, "This is unprecedented." Reeves tried again to intervene. "Objection, hearsay. This is inadmissible. The items aren't direct evidence of a crime." Judge Gaines raised his hand, silencing him. "Overruled. The jury may consider the evidence." Briggs's face turned an almost unnatural shade of red. He muttered under his breath, words lost to the gallery, but his shaking hands betrayed mounting panic. The K-9, still seated near its handler, looked almost like an observer of a strange ritual, ears flicking in acknowledgement of the tension in the room. Moreno walked slowly toward Briggs, her eyes locked on his. "Officer Briggs," she said evenly, "do you deny that Emily Carter has identified you as the man who took her?" Briggs exhaled sharply, the sound forced and harsh. I didn't take her," he said finally. His voice lacked conviction, and it was audible to everyone in the room. Emily's gaze hardened. "Yes, you did," she said softly but firmly. A shiver ran through the gallery. The words were simple, a child speaking plainly, but they carried weight far beyond their size. Whitfield interjected. Additionally, Emily described the sequence of events in detail. How she was taken, the presence of the K-9, the smell of smoke, and the objects in the storage locker. Every detail has been corroborated by physical evidence and eyewitness accounts. Briggs swallowed, his eyes darting to the judge, then the jury, then the little girl. The realization that the child's memory, so small yet precise, could dismantle years of service and a carefully curated image, was dawning fully. Sarah Carter wept openly now, holding Emily to her chest. "My baby," she whispered, rocking her daughter slightly. "You're so brave." Reeves's attempts to redirect the narrative faltered. "Your Honor, this is manipulation of a minor witness," he shouted, though his voice wavered. Judge Gaines banged the gavel again. "Counselor, sit down." His voice was sharp, commanding, but there was a tremor beneath it. He, too, was beginning to realize that this was no ordinary trial. Moreno's voice cut through the tension. "The evidence is clear. The child's testimony is corroborated. The officer's reaction has been inconsistent. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this is not conjecture or fabrication. This is truth revealed through courage, observation, and careful investigation." The jurors leaned forward, their pens moving furiously, eyes wide and minds racing. Some whispered quietly to each other. Others scribbled notes furiously, trying to capture the weight of what they were witnessing. Briggs's body language betrayed every inner fear. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the edges of the table. His eyes darted around, seeking an escape, but there was none. He had been a figure of authority, a decorated officer, but now he was trapped, exposed by the innocence and clarity of a child. Emily, clutching her bunny, looked at the K-9 again. "He wanted to help me," she whispered. But he couldn't. The K-9 remained silent, a silent witness to the truth unfolding. Judge Gaines leaned back, his pale face betraying exhaustion and shock. He had seen bravery before. He had seen manipulation. He had presided over countless cases, but never had a child's simple words carried so much weight. Unraveling decades of assumed authority and trust, that Moreno stepped back, letting the evidence sink in. The courtroom, silent now, seemed suspended in disbelief. Everyone knew, unspoken, that the balance of power had shifted irreversibly. Briggs's breathing was audible, shallow and quick. His eyes flicked to the jury, to Emily, to the canine, and finally, to the door anywhere, but the truth he could no longer escape. And Emily, tiny and trembling, had become the center of a storm she barely understood. Yet her courage had changed the trajectory of the trial. With every word, every detail, she had pulled the threads of deception until the fabric of Briggs's carefully constructed life began to tear. The courtroom sat in stunned silence. Even the reporters paused, sensing the extraordinary nature of the events unfolding before them. It was a child's testimony. But it was also just as raw, unfiltered, undeniable. The courtroom had grown unnervingly quiet, the earlier murmurs replaced by a heavy tension that pressed against the walls. Every person in the room, jurors, reporters, spectators, felt the weight of the drama unfold in real time. The evidence against Officer Daniel Briggs had already pierced the defenses that once seemed impenetrable. Emily's testimony had exposed him, and Detective Whitfield's corroborating reports left him with nowhere to hide. Briggs shifted in his chair, restless, his once composed demeanor crumbling. His hands trembled as he gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white. His eyes flicked nervously to the K9, now sitting quietly near the bailiff. Its alert posture and unwavering gaze somehow more accusatory than any human witness could be. Jonathan Reeves, his attorney, rose again, attempting to assert control. "Your Honor," he said, voice tight, "we request a brief recess to review new evidence presented this morning." Judge Gaines' eyes narrowed, studying the man he had trusted to represent the accused. He was pale, fatigue and tension etched into every line of his face. "A brief recess will be allowed," he said, though his voice lacked its usual authority. No longer than 15 minutes. The courtroom erupted into whispered speculation as Reeves hurried toward Briggs, whispering urgently. The defendant, however, did not respond. His hands shook violently now, betraying the storm raging inside him. He couldn't hide anymore. The cracks in his carefully constructed persona had become CHASMS. Sitting on her mother's lap, hugged her bunny tightly. She sensed the anxiety in the air, though she didn't fully understand it. To her, it was simply the tension of being in a room with the man who had frightened her, the man she had bravely identified. When the recess ended, Moreno called the next witness, an expert in canine behavior, Officer Mark Reynolds. The man strode confidently to the stand, his uniform crisp, his demeanor authoritative. After swearing the oath, he began his testimony. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Reynolds said, "K9 units are trained to detect changes in human behavior. Their instincts are highly sensitive. When a child like Emily is threatened, the dog will respond, not aggressively, but protectively. In this case, the K9's behavior indicates he recognized the child as a victim and attempted to intervene, though he was restrained by Officer Briggs." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Reeves rose immediately. "Objection. Speculation. The K9's behavior cannot be used to infer the actions or intentions of my client." Judge Gaines raised a hand, cutting him off. "The objection is noted, but overruled. The jury may consider this testimony," Reynolds continued. "A K9 is not trained to disobey a handler without serious cause. The fact that the dog hesitated, looked toward Emily, and reacted subtly is consistent with recognition of danger and a desire to protect her." Briggs's face drained of color. His mouth opened, but no words came. The jurors exchanged glances, absorbing the testimony in disbelief. One juror, a middle-aged woman with spectacles, scribbled notes rapidly, muttering to herself. "This confirms everything Emily said." Moreno leaned forward. "Detective Reynolds, based on your experience, would it have been possible for the K9 to misinterpret Emily's presence or the situation in any way?" "No, ma'am," Reynolds replied firmly. A dog's reaction is precise. In my 20 years of training and service, I've never seen this kind of behavior unless the child or person was genuinely in danger. Emily clutched her bunny tighter, her wide eyes fixed on the canine. It remained calm but attentive, its gaze unwavering. For the jury, it was a living testament to her words. Silent but undeniable, Marino shifted her focus to the defendant. "Officer Briggs," she said, her voice steady, "were you aware that this K9 would have intervened if it perceived a threat to Emily Carter?" Briggs swallowed hard. His hands trembled. I don't know," he stammered. Whitfield interjected from the stand. "Your Honor, if I may, during our investigation, it became clear that Officer Briggs had previously disregarded the canine signals in situations involving children. That pattern is consistent with the incident involving Emily Carter." The courtroom gasped. Briggs's head dropped, but not fast enough to avoid the jury's piercing gaze. He could feel the walls closing in, the story unraveling around him. Sarah Carter hugged Emily closer, whispering, "You're safe now. You're doing amazing." Emily's small arms wrapped around her mother's neck, the tiny weight of her courage, grounding them both amid the chaos. Marino approached the jury box again, her voice calm but firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, the evidence shows a clear pattern. A child identifies the defendant, corroborated by expert testimony. Physical evidence links the defendant to items taken from the child, and the canine's instinctual behavior reinforces the reality of the situation." The jurors nodded, absorbing the enormity of the case. The pieces were falling into place in a pattern too precise to ignore. Reeves, desperate, attempted another maneuver. He turned to Briggs, speaking under his breath. "You need to stay calm. Deny everything. Stick to your story." Briggs's lips pressed into a thin line. His eyes darted toward Emily, and then the K9. Something in that calm, unblinking gaze, the animal's silent accusation, made him flinch. He shook his head slightly, muttering, "I can't." Reeves leaned in sharply. "What are you saying?" Briggs whispered so quietly only Reeves could hear. I didn't mean it." The attorney's face paled. The jury had already noticed the flinch, the trembling, the hesitation. There was no hiding the truth anymore. Marino moved closer to Emily and crouched to her level. "Emily," she said softly, "you've been so brave. Can you tell us one more thing? What did the man say to you when he took you?" Emily's small fingers tightened around her bunny. "He said, Mommy would never find me. And if I told anyone, the dog would go away." The words hit like a hammer. Silence enveloped the room. Even the gallery, filled with seasoned reporters and law enforcement personnel, was stunned. Judge Gaines gripped his gavel, his face pale. He had seen many difficult cases in his career, but the sheer courage of this child, coupled with corroborating evidence, left him rattled. For the first time in decades, he felt the law's weight in a profoundly human and terrifying way. Whitfield stepped forward. "Your Honor, based on Emily's testimony, the physical evidence, and the canine's behavior, the facts overwhelmingly support that Officer Briggs committed the acts alleged." Briggs's body language betrayed him completely. His shoulders slumped, and his hands shook visibly. He could feel the judgment of every eye in the room, the evidence mounting like a tide he could not escape. Marino turned toward the jury one final time in this session. "Ladies and gentlemen, Emily Carter spoke truth with courage and clarity. The defendant attempted to manipulate her, intimidate her, and hide his actions. But the truth prevailed. It has always prevailed. The question before you is simple. Can justice finally recognize the victim and hold the perpetrator accountable?" The jurors scribbled furiously, some nodding slightly, others exchanging brief glances of grim understanding. It was no longer a question of doubt. The evidence had spoken with unmistakable clarity. Emily, small and trembling, hugged her bunny, unaware of the profound impact she had already made. She looked at the canine once more, sensing a silent bond of understanding and protection. Briggs sat frozen, trapped in a moment he could no longer control. His carefully constructed world, the medals, the accolades, the badge had crumbled under the simple but unassailable testimony of a 3-year-old girl and the silent witness of a loyal canine. The courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath. No one moved. No one spoke. The truth was inescapable, and in that stillness, it was clear. Emily Carter had changed everything. The courtroom felt like it had aged decades in the last several hours. Every seat was filled, every gaze fixed on the drama that had unfolded with a child at its center. Emily Carter, clutching her bunny, sat next to her mother. Her wide eyes, still glistening from tears, reflected courage that belied her 3 years. The canine sat quietly nearby, alert, a silent witness whose presence seemed to command the room's attention. Officer Daniel Briggs slouched in his chair, shoulders tight, knuckles white. His once proud uniform seemed like a costume in a theater that had long since turned against him. He glanced nervously toward the jury, then back at Emily, then at the floor, trying to evade the crushing weight of judgment pressing down on him. Jonathan Reeves, his defense attorney, was visibly frustrated. He had tried every angle, questioning Emily, challenging Detective Whitfield, attempting to discredit the K-9 testimony. But with every attempt, the cracks in Briggs's story had widened. Now, as the trial moved toward closing arguments, Reeves's confidence was fading. Judge Gaines cleared his throat, his face pale and strained. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we will now hear the closing statements. Counsel for the prosecution may proceed. Marino rose, moving slowly to the center of the courtroom. Her voice was calm, deliberate, but every word carried the weight of truth. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, you've witnessed something remarkable. A 3-year-old child has shown more clarity, courage, and honesty than many adults could muster. Emily Carter pointed out the man who harmed her. She described the events in precise detail, and every claim has been corroborated with evidence. Her eyes scanned the jury, resting momentarily on each member. Detective Whitfield presented documentation, photographs, and witness testimony, confirming Emily's account. The K-9's behavior trained and instinctive aligned perfectly with her statements. Officer Daniel Briggs attempted to maintain a facade of authority, but under scrutiny, that facade has crumbled. His own reactions betrayed the truth he tried to hide. Marino paused, letting her words sink. This case is about justice, but it's also about courage. Emily Carter's bravery allowed the truth to emerge. And now, it is your responsibility to act upon it. Officer Briggs abused his authority, threatened a child, and attempted to manipulate a loyal K-9 to conceal his crimes. The law cannot ignore the truth. The time for judgment is now. The courtroom remained silent, the weight of her words settling over everyone like a dense fog. Even Briggs's shoulders sagged further, his hands gripping the edge of the table as if seeking support. Reeves rose next, his movements more desperate than confident. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, voice slightly unsteady, you've heard the testimony. Yes, Emily spoke. She's brave and she's innocent. But a child's memory can be flawed. A child can be influenced. The prosecution has woven a narrative that appeals to emotion rather than fact. Officer Briggs served the city for years, risking his life. Can you truly convict based on the account of a 3-year-old? Some jurors shifted uncomfortably. Reeves's words, while manipulative, could not erase the images of Emily's testimony or the physical evidence. He pressed on. Consider reasonable doubt. Could there be an error? Could the K-9 have misinterpreted signals? Could Detective Whitfield's report be incomplete? You must ask yourself if certainty exists. If there is doubt, you must find the defendant not guilty. Marino rose once more to rebut. Reasonable doubt? Look at the facts. Emily identified the perpetrator unprompted, described details only someone present could know, and the canine's instincts confirmed the danger. Physical evidence items from the storage locker links Officer Briggs directly to the crime. No reasonable doubt exists here. This is truth. This is justice. The judge's gavel struck. Thank you, counsel. The jury will now retire for deliberation. The courtroom buzzed quietly as the jury filed out. Emily clung to her mother, unaware of the profound effect her bravery had already had. The canine remained seated, calm, almost regal, as if guarding the truth itself. Briggs slumped, his once commanding presence reduced to a trembling, silent figure. Minutes turned into hours as the jury deliberated. Outside the room, whispers spread through the media, creating a storm of anticipation. Reporters speculated, family members of other cases whispered, and even law enforcement officers exchanged glances of disbelief. Every person who had witnessed the proceedings understood the extraordinary nature of the trial. Inside the jury room, the tension was palpable. Jurors reviewed the testimony, weighed the evidence, and considered the child's unwavering identification. They discussed each detail meticulously. The canine's behavior, the physical evidence, the corroboration from Detective Whitfield, and Emily's specific recollections. She was so sure, one juror said. I've never seen a child speak like that. Not only sure, but detailed. Every part matches the evidence. I know, another juror replied. The canine's reactions alone are convincing. No one could manipulate that animal to behave that way. Briggs's reactions, a third juror added, voice trembling, the flinches, the hesitation. Everything he did screamed guilt. He's not just a bad witness, he's hiding something. Hours passed. Exhaustion mingled with moral responsibility, and jurors weighed every angle. Finally, consensus began to form. Emily's bravery had illuminated the truth. Briggs's facade was dismantled. The weight of justice pressed down, and the verdict became inevitable. Back in the courtroom, the tension was suffocating. Reporters leaned forward, pens poised. Friends and family clutched each other, waiting. Briggs's face was pale, his fingers tapping nervously on the table. Judge Gaines's hands rested on the bench, knuckles white. Finally, the jury returned. Foreperson, a tall woman with sharp eyes, stood. She held the paper with a trembling hand. Your Honor, we have reached a verdict. The courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath. Briggs's face twitched. Emily clutched her mother's hand, sensing the importance of the moment. The canine sat silently, its presence commanding attention. The foreperson cleared her throat. On the charge of abduction and endangering a child, the jury finds the defendant, Daniel Briggs, guilty. A wave of shock swept through the room. Sarah Carter wept openly, holding Emily tightly. Marino allowed herself a small smile, though her eyes were misted. Briggs's face went pale, the color draining completely as he sank back in his chair. His hands covered his face briefly, the reality crashing in. Even Judge Gaines was visibly shaken. He exhaled slowly, gripping the gavel. The court acknowledges the verdict, he said, voice heavy. Justice has been served today, but let this also be a reminder. Courage, no matter how small, can illuminate even the darkest truths. Emily, still small and fragile in appearance, lifted her head. Her eyes met the canine's gaze, and she smiled faintly. The silent bond between them had endured, a testament to bravery and instinct. The gallery erupted into whispered congratulations and tears. The reporters scribbled furiously, capturing the story that would be remembered for years. A child's courage, a canine's loyalty, and the unmasking of a dangerous man in uniform. Briggs was escorted out, silent and defeated. Reeves followed, grim-faced. The courtroom slowly emptied, leaving behind a sense of awe and relief. Outside, Sarah held Emily close. "You did it, sweetheart. You helped make things right." Emily hugged her bunny, exhausted but proud. The canine sat beside them, calm and watchful, a silent guardian. Even Judge Gaines remained behind, reflecting on the extraordinary events. In all his years, he had never witnessed a child's innocence and courage so directly impact the course of justice. The courtroom had become more than a place of law. It had become a crucible of truth, and at the center of it all, a tiny child's voice had changed everything. The courtroom doors closed behind Daniel Briggs, leaving silence in their wake, a silence that was heavy with relief and disbelief. Emily Carter sat in her mother's lap, her tiny body trembling from the tension that had gripped her for hours. Sarah Carter brushed back strands of Emily's hair, whispering soft words of comfort. "It's over, baby. It's finally over." Emily hugged her bunny tightly, feeling a strange mix of exhaustion and triumph. She had faced the darkness and survived. More than that, her bravery had been the catalyst for justice. Every whispered threat, every lingering fear, had been eclipsed by the power of her truth. Outside the courthouse, the world had not remained quiet. News crews clustered on the steps, cameras rolling, microphones thrust forward. The story had already begun to dominate headlines. 3-year-old's testimony brings police officer to justice. Canine loyalty helps uncover child abduction. Bravery beyond years. Emily Carter and the courtroom miracle. Reporters jostled, cameras flashing, but Sarah held Emily close, shielding her from the glare. "You don't have to answer anything," she murmured. Emily blinked up at her mother, still uncertain what all the commotion meant, but sensing it was important. The canine, now calm and resting at its handler's side, had become an unspoken hero in the story. Officers and handlers who had accompanied the dog nodded respectfully to Sarah and Emily. The animal's instincts, paired with Emily's courage, had created an unbreakable partnership that no one could deny. Within the courthouse, Judge Gaines remained behind to finalize paperwork and make official statements regarding sentencing. The verdict had been clear, but the weight of responsibility lingered. He had overseen trials before, but none had felt like this. A child's voice had appended a system built for adults, and the consequences were profound, not in chambers. The judge allowed himself a moment to reflect. He thought of the children whose cases had been dismissed or overlooked in the past, victims whose voices had been silenced. He vowed silently that no voice, no matter how small, would be ignored under his watch. Meanwhile, Detective Whitfield had coordinated with prosecutors to ensure Briggs's prior cases were fully reviewed. The evidence Emily had brought to light prompted internal investigations, revealing more than a dozen unreported or poorly handled cases where Briggs's conduct had been questionable. His suspension from the force was immediate, and criminal charges beyond Emily's case were swiftly pursued. Back at home, Emily and her mother were greeted with hugs from relatives and friends who had anxiously followed the trial. Sarah held Emily close, letting her child rest against her chest, feeling the rise and fall of her small breathing. "You are so brave," she whispered again, tears streaking her cheeks. "You helped so many people. I'm so proud of you." Emily hugged her bunny tighter and looked at her mother with a faint, tired smile. The world had been terrifying, but in that fear, she had found courage. She had faced a grown man with power and intimidation, and had spoken the truth without hesitation. In the weeks that followed, the story spread across the nation. Community members organized vigils for children's safety, advocating for stronger oversight in law enforcement, and highlighting the critical importance of listening to children. Emily became an unexpected symbol of courage, a reminder that truth and bravery can come in the smallest of packages. The canine's role was widely reported as well, celebrated as a loyal and silent witness whose instincts had aligned with justice. Animal training programs used the case to highlight the effectiveness of K-9 units, demonstrating how their unique abilities could serve communities in ways humans sometimes could not. Daniel Briggs, meanwhile, faced legal consequences far beyond the initial trial. Sentencing was severe, reflecting the gravity of his crimes. His reputation, once meticulously maintained, lay in ruins. Those who had once respected him in the police force recoiled at the evidence, the testimony, and the undeniable truth revealed by a child's courage. Sarah Carter sought therapy for Emily, ensuring her daughter had the support she needed to process the trauma. Emily attended sessions where she could speak freely, explore her feelings, and rebuild a sense of safety. Over time, the nightmares lessened, replaced with confidence and resilience that only seemed to grow stronger. Community members frequently visited, offering support and gratitude. Emily's courage had not only saved her, but had illuminated systemic issues, prompting reflection and change within the police department. Sarah spoke at public forums, advocating for child safety, emphasizing the importance of listening to children, and honoring Emily's bravery. The courtroom that had once been filled with tension became a symbol of triumph and accountability. People often recalled the moment Emily had pointed at Briggs, her small finger unwavering, and even the judge had gone pale. It became a story shared across news outlets, podcasts, and community meetings, a narrative of courage, justice, and the power of truth. Months later, Emily and her mother returned to the courthouse, not for a trial, but for a community event honoring children's courage and law enforcement accountability. Emily walked alongside the K-9, now retired, as they were both recognized for their unique roles in the case. The little girl, once terrified and trembling, now stood tall, smiling faintly, receiving applause she barely understood but felt deeply. Judge Gaines, present at the ceremony, spoke to the gathered crowd. This case reminded us that justice is not blind to age, size, or status. Courage comes in many forms, and sometimes it comes from the smallest among us. Emily Carter and her bravery, paired with the loyal instincts of the K-9, remind us that the truth cannot be hidden, and justice will prevail when we honor it. The crowd erupted in applause. Emily, clutching her bunny, looked up at her mother. Sarah's eyes glistened with tears of relief and pride. The K-9 nuzzled Emily gently, and the little girl patted its head, a silent exchange of gratitude and trust. Life gradually returned to a sense of normalcy. Emily played in the park, went to preschool, and began to enjoy the simple joys of childhood again. Sarah, mindful of her daughter's resilience, encouraged open conversations about safety, boundaries, and trust. They remained close to Detective Whitfield and the K-9's handler, forming bonds that extended beyond the courtroom and into the fabric of their everyday lives. Briggs's imprisonment and the subsequent investigations into his prior misconduct became case studies in law enforcement training programs nationwide. The story of Emily and the K-9 was included in seminars, emphasizing the importance of listening to children, observing behavior carefully, and maintaining accountability at every level. Years later, Emily would occasionally look back at photographs from the courtroom, the image of her pointing at Briggs, the K-9 calmly observing, her mother's protective embrace, and remember the courage she had summoned. Though she was small, her actions had made a monumental difference, changing the lives of many and shaping a story of justice that would endure far beyond that day. The community, forever marked by her bravery, continued to honor her indirectly. Funds were raised for child advocacy programs. Awareness campaigns on child abduction were launched, and the story inspired countless families to trust their instincts and listen closely to their children. Emily's life, once shadowed by fear, became a beacon of hope. Her small voice had challenged authority, revealed truth, and reminded the nation that courage and justice can come in unexpected forms. The K-9, loyal and unwavering, had stood silently by her side, a companion who had helped bring justice to light. In the end, it was not just a trial. It was a testament to resilience, innocence, and the extraordinary power of one child's voice. The story of Emily Carter, the canine, and the courtroom that went silent would be remembered for generations. A small finger, a brave heart, and a loyal animal had proven that the truth, no matter how deeply hidden, could never be silenced. And as Emily skipped lightly through the courthouse steps one sunny afternoon, bunny in hand, the weight of the past lifted just enough for her to feel safe, free, and proud. The courtroom had changed her life, but she had changed it forever. Justice had been served. Courage had prevailed. And a 3-year-old small voice had echoed louder than the mightiest gavel.